Some moments in life come so suddenly that you don't even realize how much they will change you until it's too late. That's exactly how the day began when Eric unexpectedly entered my room. It was an ordinary Tuesday. My husband Mark was at work, as usual, and Eric, his son from his first marriage, was temporarily living with us after a tough breakup. Since his return to our home, we had been trying to avoid uncomfortable topics, balancing on the edge of politeness. But this balance turned out to be too fragile. I was trying on a dress for a charity dinner, although it turned out to be tighter than I remembered. Annoyed, I tossed it onto the bed and was about to look for something else when the door suddenly opened. Standing in just my underwear, I froze. Eric stood in the doorway, his brown eyes wide with surprise, seemingly rooted to the spot. "Oh God!" I exhaled, covering myself with the nearest robe. "Eric!" His face instantly flushed. He muttered something, averting his gaze, and slammed the door so hard that the sound echoed off the walls. I stood alone, feeling the blood rush to my cheeks. Embarrassment mixed with anxiety. This accidental encounter was the beginning of something I couldn't understand then, but I felt it as a harbinger of a storm. Eric's return to our lives happened unexpectedly, although I should have anticipated something like this. Mark mentioned it casually one evening at dinner, barely looking at me. "He needs a place to stay for a while," he said, glancing at his phone. "You don't mind, do you?" Of course I couldn't say no. Eric had always been calm, and even seemed a bit shy to me. We rarely crossed paths before, and our relationship remained formally friendly. But now, living under the same roof, I began to notice things I had previously overlooked. At 25, he was too old to be called a boy, but young enough for his pain to be felt acutely. His appearance reminded me of Mark. Dark hair, sharp features inherited perhaps from his mother, but his eyes were different. They held a softness, a hidden vulnerability. This made his breakup with his ex-girlfriend even more palpable. "She cheated on me," Eric said one evening at dinner when Mark wasn't home. His voice was calm but broke on the last words. I didn't know what to say. "That's awful." "I'm sorry, Eric," I muttered. "No need for pity," he replied, smiling slightly, but his smile was empty. From that moment, something between us changed. I couldn't define what exactly, but his presence began to feel heavier. And that incident with the door was just the beginning. After that day, I avoided encounters with Eric as much as I could. Every time I heard his footsteps in the hallway, my heart would beat faster. I told myself it was just awkwardness, but there was something more that I couldn't fully understand. His presence in the house was no longer something familiar. It became a reminder of boundaries I was afraid to cross. Mark, as always, noticed nothing. He had his own world, endless calls, business meetings, late returns home. He said he was taking on more responsibilities so we could have a better life. But I knew the truth. Mark was always so absorbed in his own goals that he barely noticed what was happening around him. Even Eric's appearance in our home seemed to him as something taken for granted. "You're helping me just by letting him be here," he said one evening when I tried to talk about the difficulties of this situation. His tone was abrupt, as if he was trying to close the topic before I could explain myself. Meanwhile, I began to notice little things that hadn't caught my attention before. Eric started coming home earlier than usual. Sometimes I would catch his gaze lingering a bit longer than it should. He always looked away, but these fleeting moments left something unspoken in the air, making me feel strange. One evening, when Mark was late from work, I was sitting in the living room with a book in my hands. Eric entered quietly, as if checking if he could stay. "Are you looking for something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice normal. "No," he shook his head. "I just wanted to see if you'd like to watch something on TV. His suggestion caught me off guard. Usually he avoided me, just as I avoided him. "Sure," I said, putting the book aside. We sat next to each other, maintaining a cautious distance. The TV screen flickered with some news, but I couldn't concentrate. Our hands accidentally touched when he reached for the remote. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "Sorry," he muttered, and his voice was so quiet I could barely hear it. "It's okay," I replied, though my cheeks were burning. That moment stayed with me for a long time. I couldn't get it out of my head, nor the feeling that something inexplicable was growing between us. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet except for the muffled ticking of the clock in the hallway. Going downstairs to get a glass of water, I saw that Eric was already in the kitchen. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee, lost in thought. The light from under the cabinets softly illuminated his face, creating shadows that made him look older. "Can't sleep either?" I asked, breaking the silence. He looked up and smiled slightly. "Something like that," he said, looking away. I poured some water and sat across from him. We were silent for a while. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. "Have you ever felt stuck?" he suddenly asked, looking at the cup in front of him. "Stuck?" I repeated, blinking in confusion. "Like you're just living for someone else, forgetting what you want for yourself." He looked up at me, and in his eyes was a question that made something inside me turn over. His words resonated more strongly than I expected. I looked away, feeling my answer surface. "Yes," I whispered, more often than I'd like to admit. Eric nodded, his gaze still on me. "And what are you going to do about it?" His question hung in the air, and I felt everything inside me turn over. I didn't know the answer. After that night, everything became even more complicated. I noticed Eric everywhere. His presence filled the space, even when he was just silent. He started spending more time at home, finding reasons to stay in the common rooms where I could see him. I didn't know if he was doing it intentionally, but every gesture, every glance was like a quiet signal I couldn't ignore. One day, I went out to the garden to tend to the roses. Working among the flowers, I tried to calm my thoughts. The secateurs clicked rhythmically, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh greenery. Suddenly, I heard footsteps nearby. "Need help?" Eric asked, standing by the gate. I turned and saw him. The sun played in his hair, and his expression was calm, almost gentle. "Do you know how to prune roses?" I teased with a weak smile. "Absolutely not," he admitted, coming inside. "But I'm always willing to learn." I handed him the secateur, smiling. "All right, just don't kill them." We worked in silence. His movements were careful, focused, and I couldn't help but notice how confidently he held the tool in his hands. For a moment, it seemed like we were doing something simple, normal, as if nothing had happened between us. "You're doing well," I said, watching him carefully trim the branches. "Just luck," he replied, looking up at me. Something flashed in his eyes, and I felt my throat go dry. "No, really," I insisted. "You have a good eye for detail." He paused for a moment, then smiled softly. "Maybe I learned it by watching you." His words caught me off guard. I turned away, pretending to focus on the bushes, but everything inside me was burning. Later, as we put away the tools, our hands touched again, and I jumped as if shocked. He stepped back, his face slightly flushed. "Sorry," he muttered. "It's okay," I said, though my voice was shaking. These accidental moments began to accumulate, like drops of water slowly filling a vessel. Each glance, each touch seemed like another step toward something that felt inevitable. That evening at dinner, I tried to act as naturally as possible. Mark, of course, was too busy to notice the tension between us. He talked about the upcoming project, about how much work he still had to do. Eric listened, occasionally nodding, but I saw that he barely paid attention. At some point, our eyes met, and I felt my stomach tighten. I quickly looked away, but that moment stayed with me for the rest of the evening. The next day, when I was preparing lunch, Eric entered the kitchen. He silently watched me as I chopped vegetables. His gaze was heavy, as if he was trying to say something but couldn't find the words. "Are you okay?" I asked without looking up. "I think so," he replied. His voice was low, slightly tense. I glanced at him, and saw that he was looking at me in a way no one had looked at me in many years. There was something in that gaze that made me feel warmth in my chest, and a chill at the back of my neck. These moments became more frequent, and I could no longer ignore what was happening. A connection was forming between us that I was afraid to admit, but even more afraid to break. The unspoken tension between me and Eric grew like a storm cloud ready to burst. Each glance, each accidental touch intensified the feeling that we were on the brink of something forbidden. I couldn't brush off these thoughts, no matter how hard I tried. One evening, Mark called to say he was staying late at work. I was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, when Eric entered, as if hesitating whether to stay or go. "Want to watch something?" he asked casually, pointing to the TV. "Why not?" I said, putting the magazine aside. He sat down next to me, a little closer than usual. We turned on some movie, but neither of us was really watching. The screen served only as an excuse for the silence, which had become too heavy. At some point, our hands accidentally touched again. I felt my heart leap to my throat. Eric pulled his hand away but said nothing. "It's okay," I said softly, but my voice was shaking. He looked at me, his brown eyes shining with something I couldn't explain. It was a mix of guilt, desire, and something else I couldn't grasp. "I'm sorry," he muttered, getting up to leave but stopped halfway. His gaze met mine again, and for a moment, the tension between us hung so heavily that it seemed the air had stopped. "Eric," I began, but he shook his head. "Better if I go," he said before disappearing through the door. I sat motionless, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over me. My heart was pounding so hard, I could almost hear it in my ears. That moment seemed significant, as if we had passed a point of no return. The next day, everything went as usual, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. Eric avoided me, and I pretended not to notice. But it was impossible to ignore. Every time he was nearby, I felt his presence like an electric charge. Late that night, I couldn't sleep again. Wandering through the house, I found Eric in the kitchen. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee, his shoulders slumped, his face tired. "Can't sleep again?" I asked, stopping at the doorway. He looked up, his gaze heavy. "Seems so," he said, shrugging. I made myself some tea and sat across from him. We sat in silence, but this time it was almost unbearable. Finally, he broke it. "Have you ever thought you could live differently?" His voice was quiet, but each word pierced straight into my consciousness. I pondered, realizing I couldn't lie. "Yes," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life." Eric nodded, as if he understood this too well. "You deserve more, Laura," he said, his voice serious. "You deserve to be happy." I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Those words, spoken by him, seemed both comforting and destructive. Deep down, I knew it was true. We sat until dawn, barely talking, but there was something between us that didn't need words. And I couldn't shake the thought that all this would inevitably lead to something more. The climax came that evening when Mark unexpectedly returned home early. It was a Friday. I was in the kitchen, arranging dinner on the plates, when I heard the sound of the front door closing. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, and then he entered the dining room. Eric was already sitting at the table, his gaze focused on his phone screen. But I noticed how he tensed slightly when he heard Mark's footsteps. "Early today," I said with a smile, trying to smooth over the tension that suddenly hung in the air. "Wanted to surprise you," Mark replied, his voice even, but something in his tone made me tense. He sat silently at the table, but instead of starting to eat, he took his phone out of his pocket and placed it in front of him. There was a mix of anger and disappointment in his gaze, and his hands nervously tapped the edge of the table. "Laura, is there something you want to tell me?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the phone. I froze, unable to respond. At that moment, it seemed like the whole world had stopped. "I know," he said quietly, his voice like a cold blade. "I know about you." Eric looked up, his face paled. "Mark, it's not what you think," I began, but he interrupted me. "Not what I think," he sarcastically repeated, picking up the phone and showing the screen. "Messages, photos, everything. How long has this been going on?" I couldn't find the words. My throat tightened, and instead of an answer, I just looked away. "A few months," I finally whispered, feeling tears fill my eyes. Mark abruptly stood up, his face red with anger. Months, he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. I worked to give us this home, to make you happy, and you just destroyed everything. Eric stood up, his voice low but firm. It's not just her fault. I'm to blame too. Shut up, Mark shouted, his fingers clenched into a fist. You were supposed to be my son, and you betrayed me. Eric didn't back down. He stepped closer, looking Mark straight in the eyes. I didn't want this to happen, he said, and there was regret in his voice. But I love her. Those words, spoken aloud, finally shattered everything. Mark turned away, his shoulders shaking with emotion. Get out, he said, looking out the window. Both of you, get out of my house. Mark, please. I took a step toward him, but he raised his hand to stop me. No, I don't want to hear anything more. You've made your choice. Now live with it. Packing my things, I felt the weight of what was happening, as if the air had become thicker. When I carried my bag to the car, Eric was already there, silently looking at the road. I stopped for a moment, unable to take the next step. Are you sure about this? I asked, my hand shaking as I gripped the bag strap. He turned to me, his face tense, but there was determination in his eyes. I don't know, Laura, he admitted, but I know I can't let you go. We left, leaving the house behind, but the sense of loss followed me. The house was no longer a home, and our lives had turned into chaos. A few days later, I found out that Mark had filed for divorce. The news spread quickly, and the judgment of those around us became unbearable. Everyone looked at me, as if I were guilty of all mortal sins. Even friends and family turned away. Eric tried to support me, but the pressure was destroying us both. One evening, sitting in our small rented apartment, he finally spoke. This isn't what you wanted, is it? His voice was quiet, but it held weariness. I looked at him, and tears traitorously rolled down my cheeks. This isn't what you wanted either, I replied. He nodded, looking down. I'll always care about you, Laura, he said. But we can't keep doing this. He left that night, leaving me with a pain that couldn't be compared to anything. For the first time in a long time, I was alone. But despite this, a sense of strange clarity began to emerge within me. Now I knew that from now on, I would have to live only for myself.